On this episode of China Unscripted, an insider's story of how Hollywood got in bed with the Chinese Communist Party and all the crazy things the movie industry has done to pander to China's demands. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganejda.
Joining us today is Chris Fenton. He's the former president of DMG Entertainment Motion Picture Group, and for 2 decades, he worked in Hollywood on some of the biggest blockbuster movies. He's also the author of the new book, Feeding the Dragon: Inside the Trillion-Dollar Dilemma Facing Hollywood, the NBA, and American Businesses. Thanks for joining us today, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Big fan of the show. Honored.
Oh, awesome. Well, I'm a big fan of Hollywood.
Well, that's good. That's how I make a living, or used to at least.
I mean, in the old days, I was all about Bollywood, but now any movie I see, it's from Hollywood.
Yeah, Bollywood's a different breed for sure.
For sure. All right. So when you worked in Hollywood, you helped get Hollywood movies shown in China. What was your role?
Yeah, well, first of all, I still work in Hollywood, although I'm taking a little bit of a hiatus because of the message I'm trying to be a squeaky wheel about.
Are people gunning for you in Hollywood now?
You know, I've been in the business 25 years. I have really strong relationships. Is anybody joining me on this squeaky wheel crusade? No, not at all. But are people upset about what I'm bringing to light? Definitely not. And are people privately supportive of what I'm doing? And I've actually, without names on there, I've put out some of the emails I've gotten in regards to, hey, I'm glad somebody's bringing this to light. We're supporting you 100% privately. I wish I could talk about it publicly. I've gotten a lot of those emails, a lot of those calls, and I'm hoping over time I can start to pull people out of the closet and get them speaking about this with me.
Wow, awesome. Like, who's the biggest name that has written to you that said, I don't want to be known for associating with you?
Yes. Yeah, Bob Jones, the CEO. No, there's no, obviously I got to be relatively respectful about that because quite frankly, it's not something where I'm blaming individuals for staying quiet. This is, and I've talked about it in various pieces or in other interviews. If Bob Iger or Chapek, who's now the CEO of Disney, comes out and says something in support of the Hong Kong protesters, which is the opposite of what the leads in Mulan have been doing, or speaks up against the Uyghur atrocities, he'll simply be replaced by somebody who's willing to put their head in the sand and be completely silent on the issue. It just becomes a sacrificial lamb that doesn't get us anywhere. And quite frankly, it just becomes a whack-a-mole game.
So you were a part of this game back in the day. So what was your role in getting these movies into China?
Yeah, so in the book, one thing about the book is I tried to make a very approachable story to anybody who's even slightly interested in Hollywood or in the sports business.
You succeeded, trust me.
Yeah, slightly interested in China. So it's written almost as if you're watching a movie itself. And it's really telling the tale of how I fell into it, sort of in a Jerry Maguire walking out of my last job with just a goldfish in my hand type of story. Oh, now what? And there happened to be this Rod Tidwell type of business that I really didn't understand what the opportunity was with it, but it was the only one willing to go with me. So I took it on, and it led me into this world of the U.S.-China exchange of capital and of commerce and culture that was just starting to get into its adolescence. Obviously, 1979 was a big historic year. 1971, back with ping pong diplomacy, we started opening that market, but it really didn't start to get its, adolescence going, that momentum, until I think the year 2000, which just happened to be the year I got pulled into it. So what was my role? My role was to work with this very small Beijing located company that had what they called guanxi with the government to do various things in the world that was overseen by the Ministry of Propaganda, which happened to be anything in the cultural space or anything that diffused some sort of potential Western democratic principles to their populace. Movies and sports content was a big part of that. Also, music, also television. And what I'd showcase in the book is sort of how we did these little case studies that sort of grew and grew like a stone rolling down a hill gathering moss to eventually the crescendo, which happened to be the biggest blockbuster in the history of that market in 2013, which was Iron Man 3, which is that poster behind me.
So this was definitely the Chinese government actively viewing Hollywood as something it wanted to get involved in.
Well, the Chinese government, if we're talking about Hollywood itself, didn't really pay too much attention to the potential of Hollywood until the Beijing Olympics passed. The Beijing Olympics were their big coming out party. It was almost like adolescents hitting the age 15 or 16. You have that coming out party for the world to see how much potential and how much bravado you have and how much you've accomplished so quickly. And they put all of their attention on making sure that went off without a hitch. Once that passed, the CCP wiped their brow and they said, now what? What do we focus on? And they had their sights set on becoming world class, best in class in various industries. And one of them happened to be the film industry. So literally overnight, 5,000 screens popped up. In the year 2008, right at the turn of 2009, they hit 5,000 screens. And that was when Hollywood and myself said, oh, now it's a viable business. I mean, Hollywood knew back in the early 90s, mid 90s, that eventually China was going to be this sleeping giant that wakes up and becomes a huge market. But it wasn't until the 2009 when it actually had a viable size theater system where you could actually make some money. So we dove headfirst into that. And what was interesting is you could see the way the CCP was looking at that business. Number one was they knew Hollywood wanted to get access to that market. So they were figuring out, well, what can we get out of that? Well, number one was they wanted to continue building their middle class, which they had taken 600 million people out of poverty and brought them into the middle class. Film industry was one of those industries where they saw that potential. So they said to us, hey, if you help us accomplish that goal, which means help building our own local film industry, creating skilled jobs that allow people to grow into a middle class through that skill set, we'll help you get access to the market with movies that you're bringing in. So that was number one. Number two was we're trying to spread the message of what China is today and what it will be in the future. And we want to control what that message is. And we see worldwide movies, worldwide blockbusters as a great conduit for that. So if you can help us tailor our messaging while also creating opportunities for our people, we'll give you the world when it comes to allowing you to open up our market and monetize that content to our populace, which was, at the time 1.3 billion and is now 1.4 billion.
Well, it sounds from your book like, you still had to kind of sell that to Hollywood, right?
100%. 100%. Yeah, that was the difficult part because, and by the way, when I look back at this, anybody that's watching this interview, you got to understand that I was caught up in the fog of war of this globalist mission that all of us were under. It wasn't just Hollywood. It was the tech business. It was sports. It was pharmaceuticals. It was everything else that's now coming to light has been that's a problem for the American health in the long run. But back then it was, how do we open this market? How do we do it? Just do it. The more it's open, the better it is for jobs in America, the better it is for GDP growth because we're bringing money back from China and growing GDP and creating wealth. It's good for all Americans. It's good for the world, right? So that was the mission we were under. So you're asking, was it hard to sell it to Hollywood? 100%, because you got to realize Hollywood was part of the American hubris that we all sort of grew up with. Oh, well, we're the best in the world. We make amazing content. Of course, the Chinese want to see it. we're just going to make it, give it to the CCP and say, let us have access. That was sort of the idea behind it. And as the CCP started to set up really strong protectionist policies going way back into the early 90s with the amount of films that could come in, the kind of content that could be in it, the amount of revenue that you would get, Hollywood started to realize, wait, maybe they don't really want to just grant us access to their consumers. Maybe they actually want us to do something that helps them a bit in order to get access. So that was the argument that I had to use with Hollywood, which was, hey guys, you can go and make these movies without thinking about China all day long, but only a handful of them are going to get into that market. Everything else is just going to be through the piracy market, and you won't be able to monetize it, but their citizens will be able to consume it. So instead, let's think smarter and figure out, well, how can we help the CCP on some of their directives? And if we do that and they're able to showcase that to their populace, they'll grant us access to monetize that market.
Well, so I just want to establish quickly, like, what kind of movies, what kind of blockbusters did you help get into China? You mentioned Iron Man 3. What are some other names?
Well, you got to realize, like, with everything in China, nothing has been done before. I mean, we had to be historic with every step of the way. So you can't just go to Marvel and Disney and say, hey, we want to bring in Iron Man 3. Here's what we're going to do, because they would just toss you out of the room, because everybody at the time was talking about what they could do for somebody else in China. Oh, I know this guy who knows this guy, so let me do this for you and I'll make you millions and billions of dollars. There was lots of false promises out there. So what we had to do was baby step into those tent poles. So initially, I went to markets trying to convince buyers that we could get a movie into that market that never would have gotten in before. And the very first movie I was able to convince a studio to do that with was a film called Knowing, which was a Nick Cage sci-fi film that starred, or that was directed by Alex Proyas. And in order to get them to believe in me and say, oh, okay, we'll give it to you, we actually had to put some skin in the game too. We actually had to pay them, I think it was $75,000 up front just for the privilege to help them get the movie in. But it worked. And we woke up Hollywood to the fact that, wow, this little company that's been growing pretty fast seems to have the guanxi and the shili to get particular films into that market that otherwise would have never had access.
Wait. Nick Cage wasn't enough of a selling point?
No, Nick Cage was not enough of a selling point.
Right.
In fact, that movie had various supernatural things in there that were borderline censored. So it was a little bit of a rough haul, but it was also big enough so that we knew for the theater business there it would work. I mean, at the time, the only movies that were really sort of playing there were the biggest blockbusters, and most of those were with the major studios. So we had to go to a mini major, Summit, which is now part of Lionsgate, and convince them. And then we worked from that to get in more of their movies, which allowed us then to get into the Looper business with Sony and Warner Brothers and Disney and eventually Iron Man.
So you mentioned Looper, and what's interesting about Looper is, on one hand, it's about time travel, which is in theory banned by the Chinese government, to be in media and such. On the other hand, it was an opportunity to showcase the future of China, which is what you had said the propaganda ministry wanted. So because you were heavily involved in that whole process, including sort of how the relationship went for the scenes that were shot in China. So what was your involvement in Looper, and how did it go down working with Chinese authorities on that?
Okay, so since I know your audience is a wide variety of sort of people that are just interested in this topic and then also real experts, I'm gonna flat out say that for the discussions with the Ministry of Propaganda, which at the time also had a branch below it called the State Administration of Radio, Film, and Television, which then had below that the Film Bureau, which then below that had China Film Group. Those China and China conversations, I was not a part of. And in fact, those are very rarefied conversations where we had very specialized people that were doing those. But essentially, they would come out of those meetings and then tell the rest of our staff what the government wanted in regards to those films and what we were suggesting to potentially satisfy those requirements. Because obviously, if China had their way, they would have like a crazy infomercial made out of a movie called Looper, which, quite frankly, we sort of did in a way. But as you said in that podcast last year, there was a part of Shanghai that wasn't all that great. I mean, there was criminal activity, there was drug use, there was various other things. So, in order to make a good movie, you got to figure out how to carry out their directive, make the best movie possible, and figure out what the creative is to gel those two together in that Venn diagram. So, what was my role? Well, we would hear what the government wanted. We would hear sort of the ideas that we would throw to them that sort of stuck. And then they would give me the orders to essentially go to our US partners, our filmmakers, and essentially say, okay, get that done. So with the instance of Looper, we actually saw the ability to get a mid-budget movie into that market and possibly make it a top 10 hit. That movie in script form had nothing to do with China. The future in that movie took place in France. If you've seen the movie, Bruce Willis has a wife in the future. That role was going to be a French woman. There was nothing about China in the film. What we decided was, hey, here's a movie we can get our hands into early, pre-completion, right? Because up until that time, we were taking completed movies and figuring out how to get them into that market, right? Like Twilight's one that I bring up in the book where, there's undead, there's vampires, there's a lot of stuff that's censored. So we had to take a finished product and go, how are we going to market this to the CCP that allows it in? And what we did was we put a campaign together that compared Twilight to Titanic, which was one of their most beloved movies, and compared the marketing to that of how would you market Romeo and Juliet, and essentially avoided any conversation of undead or vampires. And they allowed us access. And of course, they watched over us every step of the way of how we marketed and promoted that movie.
You got Twilight into China?
We got Twilight into China.
I mean,
It's amazing we're not at war with China right now.
Well, that first Twilight movie was actually decent. They started to get pretty bad as they went along. But anyway, that's an example. I'm sorry, not to cut you off, but that's an example of completed movies trying to figure out how to make it work for the CCP. What we wanted to do after we had all that success was figure out, okay, how do we talk to filmmakers prior to a completed movie? And in fact, prior to even production, and try to tailor it to make it something that the CCP would get really excited about, help us promote and market to their populace, and make massive hits out of it.
And so I imagine that became more and more common, doing that at the beginning rather than after a movie was completed.
It never got super common because there were a couple issues at stake. One was you still had American hubris that said, oh, we're Hollywood, we make the greatest movies in the world, we don't want to cater to anybody. But then as more and more barriers seemed to get set up, the more they got open to it. But then you had the artist community, which is obviously very protective over their filmmaking and creative rights. So to come up with an idea that doesn't sound like an infomercial for China and actually makes the movie better was very difficult, right? So Ryan Johnson was the filmmaker involved with Looper. Ryan almost had final cut on that movie. He did a couple indie hits that allowed us that allowed him that protection where no one could really tell him what to do. So it was a very difficult process to get him excited about moving the future to China. So it took, sending him front page articles on China every day saying, hey, looks like things are heading towards China versus towards France. So it would make sense. And then talking about how we would shoot it there, talking about how the CCP looked at different ways to bring to life Shanghai 40 years in the future in a way that made them super proud, but also allowed us to create backdrops that had never been seen before on film. And that got him excited. And obviously also the money that we put into the movie allowed him to have more production days, more freedoms to make a bigger movie, et cetera. So it was really about finding that common ground where a filmmaker wanted to protect making the best content possible while also, trying to satisfy what the CCP needed in order to access that market.
Was Looper a co-production?
Yeah, well, that experts have been debating that for quite some time. So what we did, we had a lot of throwback on that movie. And in fact, in the book, I talk about how we came up with this idea when, Rian Johnson wanted to make the best movie possible. He only had, I think, 3 or 4 minutes worth of China footage in the final cut of the movie, which was completely unacceptable to the CCP. So we actually created an elongated China cut that allowed us to showcase all the stuff CCP wanted in there that wasn't in the global cut, that gave us the wind to our back to actually get full approval to release that film.
I didn't realize that there was a China version of that film.
There's a China version.
Because I'm thinking, I remember the film and there's like this montage, right? Where he goes to China and you see the Shanghai skyline and then, he starts to run out of money. And then, then there's like the gang stuff. And it's like the whole thing is like 4 minutes, right? The montage.
Yeah. So
how long is the China cut for that scene?
I think the China cut was another 7 minutes, I believe.
Oh, wow.
I think that was, and I'll see if I can email you guys the actual China trailer, which is unbelievable because you see a lot of the scenes that you don't see in the actual US cut. And in fact, the movie was such a hit with core fans that a lot of them tried to seek out that China cut and see it themselves. So it was really interesting, but China got a lot of the CCP and the government for allowing us to do that got a lot of critics on them. In fact, they felt like the critics complained that it was Hollywood taking advantage of China at the detriment of the local film industry and of local filmmakers. So there was a huge battle royale going on prior to the release of that movie where we were just trying to fight to keep our day and date release, which happened to be during an October fall holiday, which is a blacklisted time for any foreign films to be in. So the only way we could get in there was to keep fighting to call it a co-production. Ultimately, the critics and the film industry over there argued so hard and created so much public backlash that they wouldn't grant us a co-production right. But we ended up arguing enough of all the infrastructure, skill set exchange, middle-class directives that we accomplished, on top of how well we're showcasing Shanghai in the future to the rest of the world. And on top of it, put Summer Chang, who had a very small role in the movie, in some of the global marketing around the world for everybody to see, that the government silently gave us a local production status. And that local production status, which, by the way, the movie was in English, so it really doesn't make a lot of sense in hindsight. But that local production status allowed us to keep that October fall holiday release date, and it made it a top 10 movie for the year, a movie that should have never been in that market to begin with.
I remember pretty clearly Looper featuring China because at the time there really weren't movies that were doing that. And I definitely remember, Bruce Willis's character telling Joseph Gordon-Levitt, like his younger self, that, the future is like, you should go to Shanghai. Like, I'm from the future. You should go to Shanghai, something like that. So, like, I actually, when I was watching Looper, I didn't know yet that there had been this, like, almost Chinese co-production and, like, this release thing in China. But, even just watching the movie, that was pretty striking at the time.
Yeah, well, what we showcased, I mean, Hollywood was super skeptical about it, too, because there was a lot of publicity and a lot of journalists covering it on both sides of the Pacific. And there was a big thought that it was going to create this massive sort of infomercial for China that would shut off anybody outside of China from going to the movie. And what was interesting is that scene that you're talking about, it was actually Jeff Daniels, who was a mobster that was in charge of the young mobsters in the present day. But he got relegated to that job from a job that he had in the future. They sent him back. Hey, you know what? You need to go teach these kids how to do this stuff. So there's that scene between Jeff Daniels and Joseph Gordon-Levitt where he says, "I'm from the future. You want to go to you want to go to China." And what was interesting is that we did an NRG screening of the movie, which is to test the movie to see how it's playing and where we can fix things in the edit room. And that was the best testing moment in the film. So we knew we implemented China in a way that enhanced the movie going experience, which was a huge accomplishment and something Rian Johnson was like, if we're going to do this, it better make the movie just as good as it would have been without it, or it better make it better. And we actually made it better. And when you think about it, take away all the propaganda, involvement and all that kind of stuff. The city of Shanghai, the way it was seen in that film was different than a lot of stuff that people had seen before. So it was very fresh, very original. So that enhanced the movie going experience also.
Well, we know all about Rian Johnson's, dedication to making the best films possible. I mean, look at Last Jedi. Anyway, well, then how do you get to a debacle like the remake of Red Dawn, where it was shot with China as the villain, and then in post-production, they changed it to North Korea invading the United States?
Yeah, so we talked about the hubris of Hollywood and just saying, we're going to make a movie, and then when it's done, we're going to get it in. What we didn't talk about was sort of the ignorance sometimes of making a movie and not thinking about that market at all. And quite frankly, the PEN America report calls that a premeditated censorship. So I'm going to tread into that space. But when you look at Red Dawn, and I'll never forget, the producers of Red Dawn called and said, hey, can you come look at this movie? We have a problem with China. We need to figure out how to fix it. And I watched it and I was like, oh my God, you guys made China the enemy. Like, how do you do that and expect that to get into China? That makes no sense. And they're like, I know, we didn't even think about it. And I said, well, even worse, it's going to blackball the studio from doing any business in China. And that's exactly what happened. So we had to try to figure out what we would do, DMG, my company that I was working with, to fix that film. Ultimately, we didn't end up working on that film. But and part of the reason was they wanted to change it to the North Korean army, which is what they did. And our argument was, well, North Korea is sort of the child of China. If you change it to North Korea, they might still have a face issue with it. And of course, they ended up still having a face issue with it. And I don't know if it was because it was North Korea or just they were still ticked off that movie was ever made that way to begin with. But ultimately, the studios involved, MGM and Sony, were silently blackballed from that market for quite some time, just simply because they made that movie. Forget getting the movie in. All the other movies were penalized for the same reason.
Do you think that Red Dawn issue then basically scared Hollywood straight into how they dealt with the Chinese government?
Well, it definitely reiterated what they learned in 1997, which was around the 7 years in Tibet, Kundun time. That really woke up Hollywood to the fact that it's easy to offend China, even though China wasn't a big market back then. They started thinking, well, eventually it will be. So let's remember that in the back of our minds. Red Dawn definitely woke everybody up more than a decade later, at the time when that market actually was becoming pretty substantial. So ever since Red Dawn, people have been very, very careful.
Well, so one other specific movie I'd like to talk about is World War Z. Now, that was a movie that definitely was made with China in mind, but it didn't get any play in China, and I'm not entirely sure what the reason was. If it was because they say Brad Pitt is still kind of blackballed in China because of 7 years in Tibet. There were also issues with the original source material of World War Z that talked about, forced organ harvesting in China. And they took all of that out for the movie, but do you have any sense of what happened there?
Yeah, well, I talk about it in the book. Our big issue with World War Z was there was a Super Bowl spot that said China was dark, and that was seen around the world, and China got pretty upset about that. And then China obviously investigated what the movie was about and sort of the origins of the IP and all that kind of stuff, and they lost a lot of face in that issue. Once China loses face, you can't sort of reactively fix it. You got to proactively fix it. So our feeling was just taking any reference out of China and in the final cut is not going to fix your problem in China. You need to go out of your way to essentially amend what caused a face loss. So we came up with this idea, which ultimately Paramount and Skydance didn't do. And I talk about a bunch of the reasons why that occurred. But we said, hey, in your third act, which they had to fix, it wasn't working very well, you should incorporate China into the movie. And you need to incorporate China into the movie so that they're driving the plot forward as part of the heroic effort to rid the world of this zombie apocalypse. And by the way, you could say, well, aren't zombies, censored in China anyway? So why would you even worry about China? Well, no, that's not the case, because obviously we talked about Twilight, and then we also got the Resident Evil movies into China too. So there are ways to get those type of films in, especially if you cater to what the CCP directives are. So we created this, I don't want to give it all away, but we created this really interesting plot point where Brad Pitt, who's, by the way, not banned in China, but obviously he was for quite some time back from 1997. But Brad Pitt comes up with this rationale that perhaps the Chinese people, which we all thought would flee north to escape the Z's, because the Z's don't work very well as it gets colder and colder, and Russia hadn't seen any of the Chinese. He had this idea that perhaps instead of fleeing north, they fled up the Tibetan plateau. Obviously, we would call it something else. And in that scene, and in that third act, we would showcase the brand new high-speed rail network that they built up that plateau, which is beyond unbelievable. I mean, they have train stations at like 19,000 feet above sea level. There's sections of that train that are going 200 miles an hour where you actually have to wear oxygen masks because it's so high in altitude. So the idea was the Chinese would be fighting off the Z's, and you would just have 1.3 billion people going up that plateau, almost as if it's some shimmering lake that you see from a distance. And it made for amazing sort of cinematic sort of visuals. But ultimately, like I said, I talked through a couple of the reasons why Paramount and Skydance decided not to go that direction and just keep it safe and take China out. And they took China out, and it never got into China.
Well, one of the movies that you worked on was Iron Man 3. And you talk about this pretty extensively in the book. Would you say that that was like the movie that kind of ended up driving a lot of this Hollywood China collaboration that happened after that?
Well, Looper was definitely the best version of really incorporating China into it to get that 43% revenue share that you get as a local or a co-production. Iron Man 3 was a little different. We had huge aspirations to make it a co-production. We had all kinds of shooting on the ground that was going to take place and various other things. But ultimately, what was interesting is that Marvel, and in particular Kevin Feige, who was running Marvel, he was, and as I say in the book, he's sort of the kind of business leader that we want to have running all kinds of businesses, because his protection of what was best for the movie, what was best for his fan base, what was most important for the intellectual property library that had been built over decades of Marvel, those were always his priorities. So it was never like, hey, by the way, if we do this or do that, we're going to make X amount of more money. He never asked, okay, I'll do that, but how much more money? He said, all right, let me consider these ideas. But if it doesn't make a better movie, if my fans aren't going to like it, if it doesn't protect the brand that I'm the steward of, I'm not going to do it. Right. So that was really interesting. So ultimately, the final version of Iron Man 3 didn't have much Chinese relevancy in it. We had a character named Dr. Wu who had a very small role, but it was sort of pivotal because he was a scientific, genius that developed this medical device that helped Tony Stark. But what we did do is really showcase the little amount of shooting we did in China. We really blew it out. Like, we made sure camera crews and the CCP were on set as much as possible, seeing what was happening on the ground. We leaked photos out to make sure that all the CCTV networks were covering our stay on the ground over there. We didn't even have Tony Stark, or we didn't have Robert Downey Jr. on the ground, but instead we did have Iron Man, who was playing opposite Wang Kashi, the Doctor Wu character, in various scenes. So we had lots of photos of Iron Man. No one asked whether Robert Downey Jr. was in that costume or not. So that gave us a lot of wind to the back. But then the thing that really pushed it is, for the first time ever, we decided to do a massive movie premiere. And we did it at the Forbidden City. And remember, Beijing, there's one, that country is as wide as the United States of America. And there's only one time zone. And that time zone is whatever time it is in Beijing, right? But if you're in Beijing, the only place that really matters is the Forbidden City and that First Ring Road area, right? That is where it all goes down. So we decided to shut down the Forbidden City. Obviously, we had lots of support from the CCP. We flew in Robert Downey Jr. We coached him on everything he needed to do in order to perform at the level that we needed to, for that public to view, for the CCP to view, and he delivered beyond. And we did a televised premiere involving various celebrities around the country and really showcased the fact that Iron Man 3 came to China, was made in China, was part of China, and wanted to be a part of China. That was super important, and it allowed us really good access for marketing and promotion activity, gave us a super plum release date during, once again, a national holiday weekend, and we broke every single record there was for a movie at the time.
And how did the stars of the movie, like Robert Downey Jr., feel about this China premiere?
Robert was, I mean, you got to remember, we were all under this fog of war, of globalism, open that market at all costs, right? So Robert Downey Jr. gets paid a lot of money to be in these movies. He's supposed to go out and promote them and make as many people go and buy tickets as possible. So that was what was in his head. He listened to us. He did all kinds of crazy things, including, it was probably the worst smog day I had ever seen in all my trips over there, all my days there. It was literally like you had to like move gravy out of the sky. And all
So
his
like
people,
California last week.
Oh, it was worse than that. Worse than that. And all his people were saying he's got to wear a mask on the red carpet. He's got to wear a mask at this outdoor premiere. And we were just sitting there going, please don't, please don't. That's such a loss of face for the government there. And he decided not to, and he weathered it, and it was amazing. And by the way, the day after, it all blew out, and it was like the most beautiful day ever. It was crazy.
I do remember the photos of Robert Downey Jr. like eating tonghulu.
Yes.
Yeah.
He
like a
actually
massive
ate
one.
that stuff.
And it's interesting, in your book you have some pretty entertaining anecdotes about that premiere that reading them, if you have any experience in China, you kind of go, well, that's pretty classic.
Yeah, well, I opened so once again, the book was supposed to be entertaining and engaging to people of all walks, whether it's an expert or a layman that just wants to read a fun story. So I cold open the book with Robert's expected appearance at the red carpet in Beijing. That's essentially become the opening of the film and sort of our action sequence that gets everybody gripped into reading more, right? And one of those scenes in that opening involves probably something that you're referring to, which is, oh man, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this problem? What's the solution? And you come up with some really crazy controlled chaos solution that only you would do in China.
Yeah, definitely like sticking gum together
Oh
to
yeah.
fix the
Oh,
problem.
I mean, from the barricades that were just falling over to people climbing trees, jumping on top of us, to our security problem, even though we had plenty of them, they didn't really know what they were doing. Controlled chaos is probably the nicest version to call it.
Well, so how do you go from being the guy, responsible for getting a lot of Hollywood films into China, to being the guy writing Feeding the Dragon, this fantastic book about the dilemma facing not just Hollywood, but a lot of American industries?
Yeah, well, the idea was, over time, I'd been doing panel discussions, interviews, et cetera, talking about my different sort of anecdotes from China, and people were always like, God, that's a crazy story. That sounds hard to believe, blah, 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 blah. You should write a book. You should do a movie out of it, whatever it was. So I always knew I wanted to write about that colorful journey because it was just so crazy. It was almost hard to believe. And in fact, I sent a very early copy to it to a Fast Company journalist who had actually spent 10 days on the ground with us. And I said, hey, this is what I wrote. Do you think anybody's going to believe it? Like, you were there, you saw this stuff. What do you think? And he was like, geez, I can't believe that you wrote all that. And he's like, you didn't even get to some of the crazier stuff. And I said, I know, because people won't believe it happened, right? So it was interesting to think back about that and go, wow, I still can't even believe that was my life. But that was the idea, was just to write this colorful story. Now, what happened was that changed a little bit of that dynamic is I had just gotten back from a congressional delegation trip to China, brought over representatives Kirkpatrick from Arizona, Titus from Nevada, and Lowenthal from California as a trustee of the U.S. Asian Institute, which, by the way, I'm not speaking on behalf of here, but I'm still a trustee and I love that organization. That was an interesting trip because I was going to cap off the book with sort of these final meetings we had with Carrie Lam. You know, the book sort of ends in 2013 and it carries us forward and it showcases where we are in the relationship.
Real quick, what is Carrie Lam like?
Well, I mean, look, Carrie Lam, you have lunch with her with a bunch of people and you hear her party lines, which, by the way, everybody has. And you also feel sympathy for somebody who had, at the time, and obviously still does, but at the time she had these protests, all kinds of different issues going on, all kinds of real controversy and all kinds of pressure coming from both the people of Hong Kong and then also from Beijing. And you walked out of that meeting going, that woman probably has one of the harder jobs on earth right now. That was sort of the sympathy side of it. Of course, when you hear her party lines, you realize she is just a puppet for the CCP. And as you could see, she was just doing what she was told so that they could eventually do what they did over the past year. It was a really sort of eye-opening experience. And then we met with protesters, which obviously allowed us to understand more of what the problem was. It wasn't as simple as, oh, Hong Kong wanted to be its own free entity. It was more about a lot of injustices and encroachment of the Chinese on a lot of their opportunities, a lot of their resources, rents and housing going through the roof, a lot of the youth there not having the opportunities that they were promised to have when they became adults. So there were a lot of issues. And then, of course, we met with the foreign ministry and the CCP and the NPC and various other entities in Beijing, where you heard them talk about Hong Kong in a lot of the same way that they did, that Carrie Lam did. So you just knew that they were in complete sort of lockstep with each other. But anyway, that trip was just going to bring this timeless story into the timely and then sort of cap it off. What changed my mentality on everything and made me feel like an idiot, honestly, was the Daryl Morey tweet where he wanted us to, stand with Hong Kong and fight for them. That moment, October of 2019, was surprising that somebody from the Houston Rockets would do that because of how much money the Houston Rockets make out of China and how much the NBA is worth in China. But the moment that really changed it for me was how the American people saw the response that the NBA had towards that tweet, towards those First Amendment rights, which Daryl was exercising on American soil, how it woke the American public to the fact that that business and all others were just kowtowing to the CCP in so many different ways and hiding their head in the sands on so many different wrongs. And that made me go, oh my God, I never even thought about that, which is crazy. I never even thought about that. For 20 years, I had not thought about how complicit I was in all that. Yes, my wife would hint at it and I sort of deflected it. I was called a shill for China many times. I was, called a Benedict Arnold in the Los Angeles Times, like things like that. But my argument was, no, we're opening this market. We're creating opportunities for products and services from America in the largest consumer market in the world. That's trumps everything, right? But no, it was that day, those days after that tweet where I realized, boy, everything I was doing, it was almost like I was told to smoke cigarettes, it's good for you, and did it for 20 years. And then suddenly a study comes out and says how bad it is. And I'm going, oh my God, we've been doing this for 20 years. That's terrible.
So you think a lot of people in Hollywood, and not just Hollywood, but like the NBA, as you mentioned, are kind of operating under maybe the way you used to think about this, how it's like, oh, this is obviously a good thing. How could it be a bad thing?
I don't think um, I don't think people believe it's right. I don't think people believe it's terribly wrong either. That's the part that is, you got two things chirping in your ear on both shoulders. That's what the torn behavior and mentality is of people in Hollywood, people in the sports industry, people in tech, whatever. And then on top of it, you have the fear of losing a job, of losing revenue from what is the largest market in the world for a lot of these products and services. So people are cognizant now of what they're doing that's wrong, but I think they're justifying it with enough things that they think are right that balance the equation in their head. I believe that there is a compromise to find, and I've been vocal about it, which is I don't mind the idea of censoring our product on the ground in China for their populace, right? They have a firewall anyway, so they can do it. And if we don't do it, they're just going to censor it anyway and let it proliferate through the piracy black market so that we don't monetize it at all. So why not do what we do with Japan, Korea, the Middle Eastern markets, various other markets where we censor for that particular market so that we can monetize it. That's I'm okay with. Okay. And I get it. There's going to be detractors on that one too. Where I have a real problem is China now saying we're going to govern the way people talk about us outside of our soil, outside beyond our borders. And what Daryl Morey did was a First Amendment right in the United States of America. If he did that in China, I would say that's wrong. But he did it here. And the big problem I have with that is that they can firewall to make sure that tweet was never seen by anybody in that country other than people with VPN or can get around a firewall, which is a small part. They can firewall it. They can censor it. It's censored for their people. But they want to control the fact that we're talking about it out here and somebody might be talking about it in Germany. And they're trying to do the same thing with Top Gun, where we can't have the Taiwanese and Japanese flag on Tom Cruise's jacket, not for the movie to show in China, but for the movie to show anywhere in the world, right? That is cross-border censorship. And that is a directive that is infringing on our First Amendment rights. And it's something we simply cannot tolerate. And there's a part of me that believes, like we talked about, adolescence of China coming into the capitalistic world. I believe China is a bit like a teenager. They'll press and press until there's pushback, right? They're like the teenager who had the 10 o'clock curfew and the parents aren't pushing back, and slowly that curfew becomes 2 a.m., right? We need to push back. If we push back with just a single entity, a single GM of Houston Rockets, a single company, a single CEO, a single celebrity, it's not going to work. It's whack-a-mole, sacrificial lamb. But if we do something like we're seeing right now with the BLM movement, where the NBA pulls in all the other major sports leagues and they get behind it, this is a domestic issue, obviously, but they get behind that very important domestic issue. Why can't we do it with an international issue like China? If we get all the sports leagues together and say, hey, we stand behind what Daryl Morey said, and we're not going to allow you to retaliate. And if you do, you don't get any of our sports content from any of these. And you don't get any of the products and services that Nike makes or Under Armour makes or Adidas makes. And then on top of it, Hollywood joins that solidarity and says, you're not getting any of our content. We are protecting the rights of this individual and our rights here in America. Suddenly, China will back up.
But there's no political consequences for the NBA supporting or not supporting BLM. There are political consequences and very obvious economic consequences. Even if the NBA were to get all the major sports leagues to stand up and say, we're not going to allow censorship or interference, from China, the Chinese Communist Party can essentially say, okay, well, no more basketball, no more baseball, no more hockey. That's it. No more access to China, and that's a much more serious consequence than in the U.S. Oh, some people like Black Lives Matter, some people don't like that movement, but it's not going to really affect the market so much.
Well, I disagree. I mean, I'll say the idea that a lot of the hubris behind the NBA had, which is, oh, if we take a stand, they can't live without the NBA in China, right? That I think is a little far-fetched. Like they can deflect off of the NBA and get the populace excited about the China, the CBA over there or some other thing. But if all that content says, no, we're boycotting China. And by the way, you include the IOC in that situation because the Beijing 2022 Olympics is a huge pressure point for the CCP. So if you create solidarity between all that content, sports content, entertainment content, and then you bring in the industries around it, whether it's IMAX, whether it's Activision, whether it's Nike, suddenly you create such a problem for the CCP. They know their people want this stuff. If they didn't, then they would say, hey, we're not letting anything in. No piracy, no monetization ability, nothing. We're not going to let any of it in. But they know enough people want that stuff that if they shut it all out, they might have a problem with their leadership. Remember, they don't want 1.4 billion people finding a reason to create another Tiananmen Square, right? So in that strength in numbers situation, it will work. And I'll give you an example of why it will work, right? You got me running on this one. Wolf Warrior diplomacy. Do you remember that initiative?
The movie
over the last
Wolf Warrior?
No, the
Wolf Warrior diplomacy, the initiative by the Foreign Ministry of China over, I would say, the past 9 months. A lot of it was sort of trying to spread this new COVID, sort of message, but it was also very forceful Belt and Road initiatives, very forceful forced loans, et cetera, right? Wolf Warrior diplomacy. It was huge for about 6 months. But what happened? Australia started to retaliate. Various European Union countries, including Scandinavian countries, started to retaliate, and so did the U.S. And what happened to Wolf Warrior diplomacy? That was a big initiative of the Foreign Ministry. I haven't heard a thing about it in the last 6 weeks. Why? Because, like a teenager, they saw the parents push back, and now they're retreating.
Well, that's one thing for countries, for governments to do. But, multinational companies, they've been trained for the last 20 years about, what you have to do to go into China. And that is, acquiescing to the Chinese Communist Party's demands, not making them lose face. And you get to the point where, U.S. airlines are afraid to put Taiwan on their website. How do you go from that to like a stance where you're getting companies to work together to stand up to the CCP?
Well, it ain't easy. And it's a red and blue issue. It's not Democrat, Republican. I like the fact that the Republican side has really been bringing attention to the fact that China is a problem. I think the Democratic side is starting to get on there in regards to human rights issues, various censorship, freedom of speech issues. It's going to be both parties working together on this. But like I said, watching what happened with the BLM movement here and how quickly solidarity started to form between all the sports leagues gives me hope that we can figure it out on an enterprise capitalistic system. But then on top of it, to combine that with the leadership of this country, where we say, hey, we're backing Daryl Morey's First Amendment rights. All these companies are, and us as a nation is doing it also, and pull in Western alliances to also do the same thing, we can get this done. Don't get me wrong. I am not about decoupling from China. We've spent 40 years on this marriage. We are so intertwined. We have so many children involved, like just flatly breaking off everything, it would create a war, quite frankly. So decoupling we need to do in sort of a American health, American values, American priorities, national security interests first. like supply chain issues, various other things where we bring manufacturing back. But that market is way too important to us to sort of shut off. But we do need to find a way to push back because every week, every month, every year, we're seeing the CCP push farther and farther against what we feel is the right thing to do in order to access that market. And as that market gets bigger and bigger, they're going to do it more forcefully and more forcefully. So if we don't find a way to counter that with some sort of pushback against the teenagers, we're going to find ourselves, as Trump says, speaking Chinese someday.
Do you think this is really, it comes down to an issue of the American public kind of waking up to what the Chinese Communist Party is, their human rights violations, and then making demands on Hollywood, on the NBA, on American businesses and the tech companies to take a stand? So it becomes a choice between the American market and this repressive Chinese market.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that question is both directed directly at the capitalistic system that we have here with all the businesses and industries, but then also directed at our elected officials, because we do need the constituents of this country to back it and get super excited and animated and make sure it stays in the public eye constantly, right? So Daryl Morey did us all a favor and woke everybody up. But now we need people to put pressure on our leadership and on these businesses to essentially do the right thing. And in a perfect world, I see a space where we push back, we get things mitigated that the CCP was doing that they have built up on over the past decade or two. But then also companies are very good about, I mean, they've always been good about messaging to the CCP as to why their product and service should be in that country, and then messaging to the populace as to why they should consume it. But I think the same thing has to happen here in the US. Hey, Nike, you're pushing through this new agenda, this new initiative, this new product or service. Like, why is that good for the United States of America? And they need to have the bullet point presentation of why it's good for all Americans, the same way they do it for the CCP. Oh, we're doing a venture where half of it's made here in the US. Those are the skilled jobs. We're doing the T-shirts in China. This is something where we feel like we're pressing democracy and more of the cultural fabric of what makes democracy into their market through these new shoes, through these new campaigns, whatever it is, so that you're balancing the messaging so people feel like, oh, okay, I'm supportive of that. I'm not going to speak out against that one because Nike's doing it appropriately.
So what advice would you give? Is that the advice you would give to companies now that have a big business presence in China?
Well, the advice right now that I would probably give is, at the moment, I don't know if there's enough of that fervor in the United States to warrant taking your heads out of the sand and swatting the wasp nest with a bat. It's getting there. So one of the things that I think, and I'm working with a handful of reps on the China Task Force for Congress, but one of the things I think might happen in a short term is possibly a lot of CEOs from Hollywood or other industries getting called to Congress to talk about this stuff in a public setting. To me, I feel like we should be more proactive about it on the Hollywood side and actually reach out to Congress and have a sit down privately and talk about the pressures that those CEOs, those investors and shareholders are putting on them, so that Congress understands those pressure points. And then Congress can also talk about the pressure points they're getting from constituents. Because I think if privately some sort of resolution occurs where a solidarity between our public leadership and our private entities can actually work together to push back the CCP and do that without some soapbox public forum, I think that would be in everybody's best interest. So I would recommend Charles Rivkin, who runs the MPA, the Motion Picture Association, to sort of work as a speaker on behalf of all the entities in Hollywood and say, hey, I'm going to talk to Congress. I'm going to figure out how we can start to implement things that alleviate some of the pressures we're getting out from the public on what we're doing wrong in China. And we need to figure out If we do that, how can we pressure the CCP to back off? And I would argue somebody like Phil Knight, who's a emissary for the sports industry, might be able to do that for the sports business and do the same thing. And we can collaborate together, creating a unified front to not only push back the CCP on various issues that we feel are going beyond what we can tolerate, but also placate, the anger and the frustration that the American public has right now.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. This was really exciting. And once again, the book is Feeding the Dragon. It is a great book, but Chris, give us a little plug for that and where people listening can follow you.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm new to Twitter over the last few months, but it's grown very fast. I'm at the Dragon Feeder, so I'd love anybody to come on there and have some fun. We stay right in the lane of China, Hollywood, the NBA, and various other issues between the U.S. and China. And it's also, I add some fun into it rather than just straight policy, because I do come from the entertainment business. Feedingthedragonbook.com has all the information on me and the book, and you can go on to Amazon or your local bookstore to buy the book. Once again, we talked a lot about, maybe more policy-oriented solutions to this problem, but the book itself really describes in a colorful way and an entertaining and engaging way how we actually got here. Like, we're not all evil capitalists that were selling out America. We were just simply trying to get the job done in a very sort of chaotic situation between the US and China in 2000 to 2015. So I really hope people enjoy it. Absolutely humbled and honored to be on this show. I'm a big fan. Please keep up the good work. And let's keep this out in the public discourse. We need to keep talking about this issue.
Definitely. I mean, it's been great having you on, Chris. And, if in the future you hear of anyone who needs a, good-looking Agent Smith lookalike to star in some major Hollywood blockbuster, I'm available. I've taken some acting lessons,
Excellent. Well, we'll put you in the next big co-production for sure.
Perfect.
Yeah, go to China, Chris.
Number one ticket.
Yes.
Exactly. Well, thank you guys again. Humbled.
Thank
All right,
you.
thanks.
Take care.
Take care.
Yeah, he said some of those stories about working with China were crazy. And really, if you read the book,
It's pretty crazy. I mean, like I said, it's a little familiar. If you're familiar with China, you'll kind of look at it and be like, oh yeah, there's that Chabadoa stuff,
yeah, we don't want to give anything away because it really is an exciting book. But yeah, the stories are insane.
I do have to say that I'm a little bit pessimistic about whether, these multinational companies will actually stand up to China.
I mean, it's up to the American public to demand that change. They'll do whatever is profitable for them. And if the American people stand up and say, hey, Nike, stop getting cotton from Xinjiang slave labor.
Actually, they won't be able to do that soon because of U.S. sanctions.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, I think Chris's point is the salient one. Actually, one of the names that Chris Fenton brought up is the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. And for a long time, they've been very beholden to Chinese interests.
I think it's already too late for the IOC.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
Well,
I think
I know,
it's like
but
the WHO.
I also think it's too late for the IOC.
It was too late in 2008.
However, if somehow, magically, because we waved some wands here, if somehow the IOC could be on board with it, then it would completely change things, because the 2022 Olympics is massive leverage over the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, and if it's not in China, of course, it'll have to go to a nice liberal democracy like Kazakhstan.
Yeah, the other choice. Okay. Well, also, it depends on whoever is the president in 2022. Are they like, I'm going to go to the Olympics in China, and boy, it's so great, it's so nice? Or are they going to be like, no, China is a brutal authoritarian regime, I'm not going? That would say something.
The Winter Olympics, which is the less exciting.
Yeah,
That's true,
Winter
but
Olympics.
still,
I think one thing we forgot to talk about was Mulan,
Oh, yeah.
which I wonder.
He did touch upon, because the main actress in that has stood up in support of those hardworking Hong Kong policemen.
Not just her, Donnie Yen, who's
Oh,
like
yeah.
he's like a general in the movie.
He Jackie Chan'd me.
He did totally pull a Jackie Chan. Yeah. It's so disappointing. I used to like the Mama movies.
Yeah, turns out he's very pro-CCP, at least in public.
But, Disney is releasing the movie in the U.S. on Disney Plus,
Mm-hmm.
but you have to pay an extra like $20 or It's
trying to make their money
30
back on that.
bucks. It's a lot of money to be able to see it on demand. But in China, they're going to release it in theaters.
Oh.
So
because the virus has been solved in China.
Mhm.
Right.
So the thing is that like if Disney loses money in the US on this movie that they've, been, plugging for ages, and it was going to have like this huge worldwide blockbuster back in March, and definitely it has like all of the, buy-in from the Chinese Communist Party, and all of the, stars are Chinese and all this stuff. Like, if it loses money in the US but makes a lot of money in China, I think that's only going to cement Hollywood's whole, like, we need to turn to China as the biggest movie market.
Maybe. But it's so, like, their rules are so hard to understand. Like, you're not, like, in Chinese movies, you're, like, not supposed to have supernatural things. And yet, as Chris was saying, one of the first movies that got in there was that Nicolas Cage movie, and his acting skills border supernatural.
Oh, is that what
I
you
was
were
wondering where you were going with that, Chris.
Okay. I mean, I was surprised that Twilight got in. It was not a big movie in the
Yeah, I was
US at the
surprised.
time, but I guess it was Summit Entertainment, which was also kind of, they were working on that with knowing. So, yeah. I don't, like, it's changed a lot.
Yeah, but I mean, the whole idea of like, the undead walking around has been in modern China for a long time, like Jiang Zemin.
Oh, I was wondering where you were going with that. He needs some help now walking around. It was his birthday like a couple weeks ago, actually.
How
like
old is he?
94?
94.
Wow.
This is the skin of a mass murderer, Bella. That was my really bad Jiang Zemin impression.
He does
I-
speak English.
I do not
He
even
does.
know how you do it, John. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
No,
on that
note, I should probably not try to go any further with that.
No, try to go further. I'm curious to see that.
No, look, Jiang Zemin had really good English because he worked very hard at it. And it made him, much more relatable for foreign leaders.
So naive.
And so, I guess I don't want to do an impression of Jiang Zemin, but
Don't do it.
But I'm just my point is that it is amazing that someone so old and frail and disgusting is walking around. He's almost as old as Edward the vampire is in the movie.
Shelley, you seem tense.
I also agree though that this is a good time to wrap this podcast up.
I've just been like doing the Jim stare into the camera for like the last minute and a half.
Editor, zoom in on Shelley's face. Thanks for watching China Unscripted. I'm sorry we kind of dropped the ball there at the end. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Jung.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
We'll talk to you next time.
Please continue to listen to our podcast.